But you can see it now though, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the technical issue. Um, Thank you to Maria and Teresa for this wonderful opportunity to share my work with you. So, my talk is titled Early Modern Feminist Approaches to Misogynistic Bias in the Historical Archive. And so I'm a historian of philosophers. So um, uh, I would like to talk about two authors and explore. So the two authors will be Poulain de la Barre and Louis Dupin. So Poulain de la Barre, late, I would say, 17th century. Louis Dupin, first half of the 18th century. And so I would like to explore in this talk two approaches within early modern feminism to the historical archive, understood as available sources for reconstructing women's history and explaining gender inequality. So the first approach involves the creation of historical conjectures of human society. So let's see. Here's the structure of the talk. So this first approach involves the creation of historical conjectures of human society, as I was saying, and these are highly speculative reconstructions of humankind's origins, which are detached from the pretension of empirical accuracy. And they are highly significant in an epistemic and a political sense because they seek to explain and denounce the genesis of gender inequality. And the second approach, conversely, reclaims empirical history for feminist ends and seeks to reconstruct women's history and dismantle essentialist myths about female inferiority. So I will explore these two approaches in François Poulain de la Barre's feminist treatises, but I will mainly focus on the l'égalité des deux sexes and in Louis Dupin's Des Femmes. And I will analyze their position on the trustworthiness and epistemic authority of historical sources, as well as their strategies for addressing misogynistic bias within their work. So first, um, a little bit of context, an overview of that intellectual context with regards to how history as a discipline, as a practice was understood at the time, in order to link this to uh, their feminist approaches to the historical record. So these are the images of their uh, works. Um, so in the early modern period, the very concept of history was undergoing profound instability and transformation, driven by new epistemological demands for historical knowledge. And a major catalyst for this crisis was the rise of the Cartesian philosophical project, which redefined standards of certainty, simultaneously serving as a critical platform against prejudice that undermined previously accepted epistemic authorities. Descartes' quest for absolute certainty fueled historical Pyrrhonism, um, that is a skepticism about the possibility of producing evidence-based historical knowledge with an acceptable level of certainty. So this crisis of historical certainty was exacerbated by broader religious or secularization movements of the time. So think about, for instance, the Protestant Reformation and the emerging standards of modern science, which undermine the ideological hegemony of sacred history and cast doubt on the reliability of historical testimonies, as Daria Perinetti explains. Intellectuals interested in humankind's remote origins, particularly the origins of government and moral norms, faced a dilemma. Either admit the task was impossible due to a lack of reliable sources and thus succumbing to historical Pyrrhonism, or adopt a more modest, probabilistic methodology. So the debate about what can constitute a reliable historical source, for example, whether fables and myths are acceptable sources for historical reconstruction, was very polarizing at the time. Hence, the heavy focus on evidentiary analysis conducted by antiquarians, philologists, as a necessary condition for historical research created a challenge for those historians and philosophers who wanted to retain the aspiration of offering an encompassing universal history of humankind. In this context, the emergence of the historical conjectural approach evinces a negotiation, and it can be understood as a methodological approach to the perceived lack of unreliable sources. This approach employs conjecture, so recent speculation, to reconstruct the initial state of humankind precisely because empirical evidence was unavailable. Its method relies on backtracking. So philosophers began by observing the present state of society and then logically deduced a plausible initial state from which the current situation must have evolved. And by defining these hypothetical beginnings, they seek to explain how current arrangements came to be and ultimately delegitimize existing power relations and moral norms in the present. This made the study of the origins in early modern feminism an inherently political and ethical project. So let's talk a little bit about Poulain, Dupin, and their criticism of historians. So in De l'égalité des deux sexes, which was published in 1673, Poulain de la Barre leads a philosophical battle against the prejudice of women's inferiority. De l'égalité is the first part of what would become a kind of feminist trilogy with the publication of L'éducation des dames in 1674 and De l'excellence des hommes in 1675. In his feminist works, Poulain radicalizes the Cartesian epistemological project of revising inherited opinions and fighting prejudice via rational analysis of beliefs. According to him, the prejudice of women's inferiority has two main forms of expression. It exists as a vulgar opinion and as an expert opinion promoted by the savant. Each of these forms presents its challenges because, as Martina Reuter explains, Poulain recognizes that the disarticulation of prejudice cannot only rely on rational analysis, as prejudice are entrenched epistemic commitments reinforced by habits and customs. So when targeting this savant, specifically historians, Poulain de la Barre criticizes their lack of objectivity and foundational unreliability of their narratives, particularly when they speak about the purported inferiority of women, producing testimonies that, and I quote, are vain and useless. He seeks to untangle and reveal their bias to undo their epistemic authority. As Marie-Frédérique Pellegrin explains, the savants for Poulain are considered, and I quote her, cogs or gears in the mechanisms that are the intellectually and socially coercive institutions of the university and the clergy. They are like a veritable caste, zealous of its intellectual authority. So Pellegrin writes in French. I translated this myself, but so just to clarify. So historians exaggerate the virtues and advantages of their sex and conversely demean and weaken the merit of women, thus feeding their own self-interest or what Dupin will afterwards call male vanity. Okay. So according to Poulain, they base their conclusions not on truth, but on inherited errors and established norms. They join customary beliefs with the opinions of the ancients, upon whose unrevised authority their entire certainty is founded. And in doing so, they critically repeat and amplify a tradition of prejudice and error. So for him, however, the ancients were no less human than we are, nor less subject to error. They regard women with just as little reason as people do today, says Poulain. And he adds, this is so easy to recognize that we don't even need to give examples. So it's quite obvious for him. The way historians present information makes their bias highly influential because historians, he says, seem not to advance anything of their own accord, making their testimony less suspect. So they merely appear to be reporting historical facts when they build their biased misogynistic portraits of women. We also find, so let me just, this is the French text. Yeah. We also find a vehement criticism of the historian's misogynistic bias in Louise Dupin's magnum opus, if we can call it that, her Ouvrage sur les femmes, most commonly referred to as Des Femmes. So, Des Femmes is an extensive feminist treatise written during the 1740s and believed to have been abandoned by 1751. It was never finished by her. And like most of her writings, remained unpublished during her lifetime. So unfortunately, I won't really have a lot of time to talk about the history of the discovery and the reconstruction of this work, but it's all very recent. In late 2022, Frédéric Marty published a critical edition of the Femmes, and in 2023, Angela Hunter and Rebecca Wilkin also published an English, an English edition of a selection of passages. But they sort of had the very difficult task of reconstructing this work from many manuscripts that were found and were scattered throughout a lot of different archives, both in North America and in Europe. And Hunter and Wilkin actually described this work as the most substantial feminist treatise of the French Enlightenment. It's a very long essay, and Dupin, in the Femme, Dupin rigorously defends gender inequality and provides an exhaustive study of a wide array of philosophical, scientific, literary, legal, historical sources that aim to establish women's inferiority, dismantling their misogynistic claims with meticulous scholarship. So Dupin argues that the sexist prejudice against women has gradually intensified over the centuries as men's privileges steadily grew and accumulated. So let me show you this quote. So she believes that women's subjugation is a relatively modern phenomenon. So that the idea that women's laws of economic and legal rights has exponentially increased in the last century due to what she calls les usurpations modernes. But the attentive study of the past disproves the idea that this power imbalance between men and women is natural or transhistorical. And so, like Poulain, Dupin recognizes that the production of historical knowledge entails a power struggle where historical narratives emerge to serve particular interests and compete, and they try to establish their hegemony. So she denounces historians who incur in bad practices in order to feed male vanity and disregard women's interests. So she says, I quote her, no one protests false claims or gross omissions involving women. No one defends their interests. And the ignorance in which women have been raised for some time now prevents them from standing up for themselves. Thus, no piece of falsified or neglected history concerning women, nor any consequence extrapolated from that dubious historical record, encounters any obstacle today. This is the end of the quote. So while Poulain focuses on denouncing the ancient origins of women's subjugation, Dupin asserts that recent centuries have witnessed an alarming and exponential decline in women's rights, marking a significant historical regression rather than a simple continuation of age-old patterns of oppression. She denounces how contemporary scholars distort or give false accounts of the situation of women in the past, trying to paint women's dependency of men and the unequal legal rights of men and women as a transhistorical phenomenon. And to this end, Dupin writes, and this is my next quote. I'm using Hunter and Wilkins' English selection of passages, by the way. So she says, granted, it is quite common for an author to lend all of the colors and opinions of his own century to the one he's painting without even being aware of it. Yet, the fact remains that the kind of reflection that ensures against this problem is the foundation. Oh, what did I do? Sorry. Uh, okay, here. Is the foundation of all good historical works. And just as we might apply this reflection to other historical matters, should we not also apply it to subjects involving women, especially when historians are bent on making past centuries serve as an example to justify all kinds of exclusions imposed on women today? Okay, so um, let's talk about Poulain and Dupin and their conjectural approach to humankind's origins. So in order to study Poulin's historical conjecture within a generalized framework of early modern philosophy of history, it is necessary to emphasize, as Marie-Philippe Pellerin asserts, his genealogical imprint. Poulin uses a regressive approach, which instead of seeking to justify the legitimacy of the state of governmental authority, as is the case, uh, for example, for contractarianists, he seeks to highlight the illegitimacy of modern forms of domination by revealing their violent origin. Let's see if I have, yeah, I have certain passages there from his historical conjecture. So, according to him, women's submission is based on the law of the strongest, which means that it is not legitimate, but rather the consequence of power dynamics. At the beginning of the world, he says, women and men were equal in all areas of life. These idyllic origins of humanity predate any form of government, education, or religion. Couples who had children formed small families. Women relied on the help of men when they had to take care of the young children, which created a form of dependency that did not challenge, however, their egalitarian balance of power, according to Poulain. Nevertheless, as family units expand, especially when multiple generations live together in the same house, patriarchal authority emerges. So the larger the group, the more polarized the hierarchies of power. And two key factors determine positions within these hierarchies: gender and age, with men and elders dominating. The sexual division of labor that stems from this power dynamic, where women submit to their husbands and children to their fathers, reinforces women's responsibility in domestic affairs. Okay, so the next step. Younger siblings who feel that they will always be in the shadow of their older brothers leave their homes in the hope of becoming the heads of their own families and gaining access to a freer future. They form alliances with other men in the same situation in order to acquire wealth and goods. These bands of conquerors plunder established families and reduce them to servitude, which further aggravates the enslavement of women who are treated as the spoils of war. According to Poulain, women did not participate in conquest or battle because of their humanitarian nature. So, what about Dupin? So, Dupin adopts a position that I described as. Sorry, Maria, were you saying something?
Have 10 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So she describes a position that she adopts a position that I describe as critical continuity with Poulain, which implies a double innovation in relation to her predecessor. On one hand, Dupin first takes up Poulin's strategy of proposing a hypothetical reconstruction of the origins of human social organization, but modifies Poulin's conjecture to radicalize his egalitarian claim. On the other hand, the author of Des Femmes will encourage archival work from various historical sources to look for concrete examples of women, laws, and customs, all with the aim of proving that the subjugation of women is a progressive and mainly modern phenomenon. That is to say, more gradual than Poulain seems to imagine. And she believes that it has been strongly consolidated in a relatively recent period. So Dupin's historical conjecture is distinguished at first glance by the description of a more egalitarian beginning of society in terms of gender, where motherhood does not constitute the entry into dependency for women uh, as Poulain seems to assume. So let me show you just, yeah. Dupin reconstructs or constructs an image of the origins where patriarchal hierarchy and misogynistic prejudice does not yet exist. So she hypothesizes that families and communities could have been led and governed indifferently by men or women according to the dignity, reputation, age, and merit of each of the candidates. Dupin radicalizes Poulin's egalitarian approach. Women could be political as well as military authorities, according to her. We may infer this from the fact that long after these imaginary beginnings, we observe women waging war alongside their male comrades and even in all female communities. Moreover, Dupin rejects the idea that men have a significant advantage over women because of their physiological constitution. For the author of the Femme, the stage of conquest was also decisive because it showed that by satisfying the ambition of territorial conquest, the old codes that maintained the balance of power between members of a community were broken, and oppressive relations like a master and slave were thus made possible. So male territorial invasion is coupled with a narcissistic, passionate expansion. Um, so Dupin aims to account for this progressive evolution with the help of historical examples, by which she strives to demonstrate that in ancient times, women had an undisputed presence occupying positions of power on an equal footing with men. When she analyzes the history of Christianity, for example, she shows that in the first centuries, the apostles, priests, and some of the holy figures were married and had children, and that deaconesses fulfilled the same functions of priesthood as deacons. Um, Her reasoning deduces the existence and function of these women in part from the latter prohibitions that decreed the exclusion of women from these positions. So what she's thinking is, if there had been no deaconesses, why would it have been necessary to ban them, right? So for Dupin, the prohibition of the church's ministry to women is a consequence of the imposition of celibacy on priests. Um, and she talks about the Council of Trent as a severe blow to the freedom of nuns by ordering enclosure in women's religious orders who were placed under the control of the bishops. Um, yeah. Okay. She also talks about military orders, so female military orders, and she gives examples of ancient civilizations that were ruled by women, by queens. So this is just some examples. I won't have time to go over everything, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of her reconstructive work for the history of women in the Femme. So she says the tradition of the Ethiopians was to be ruled by queens who themselves led their armies while their husbands remained in their palaces. Um, so Based on these characteristics, we can conclude that the Ethiopian government was genocratic. And she also gives the example of the Amazons as a female society, an all-female society whose existence she did not doubt. She believed that they existed. And she even recognizes some contemporary examples. So, for instance, this all-female society in what we would now call Chilean territories. Okay, so to conclude, if early modern feminist thought resorts to conjecture to imagine a history of the origins of humanity, it is because it distrusts androcentric narratives and archives, historical artifacts constructed to conceal the value of women and the genealogy of gender inequality. Poulin's historical conjecture, as well as his feminist exegesis of key passages of the scriptures, inspired Dupin to delve into the archives to try to reconstruct women's history. Indeed, okay, here's my conclusion. Indeed, Dupin takes into account many cultures from different parts of the world to do this. Her sources are truly eclectic and, in most cases, as the author herself admits, contain an androcentric bias that makes them unreliable as legitimate sources of historical knowledge. But Dupin's work is, I quote Hunter and Wilkin here, a vast program of feminist recovery. So rather than rejecting adverse sources shaped by patriarchal bias, she engages with them critically to challenge their authority and deactivate their effects, try to repurpose them for her feminist project. So by creating historical conjectures, early modern feminists endeavored to retrieve an egalitarian remote age of humankind in order to show that patriarchal oppression need not be an inexorable destiny of humanity. Um, and so I have a quote that I really love from um, Claudine Poulouin, uh, where she says, the origin, this is my translation again, the origin, a primitive scene that has been erased but still organizes time, is long after universal history has been stripped of meaning, seen as the only way to reconstruct the unity and totality of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for such an interesting talk. So let's move to the Q&A, people. Go to the reactions, raise your hand, and ask questions for something like 15 to 18 minutes. So, Teresa, please.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia, for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the discovery and reconstruction of Dupin's treatise.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the fam is actually compiled, I mean, created, I would say. Um, it's based on, I don't know, I think it's a lot of manuscripts, a lot of drafts, propedeutic material, like preparatory material. So one of the reasons that these manuscripts were preserved was that they were handwritten. Many of them were handwritten by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who at the time of the writing and the preparation of this essay was Dupin's secretary. So, um, so this is one of the main reasons why they were preserved. So she dictated this sort of drafts to him, and he also we can also assume that he did a lot of the archival work in which the femme is based upon. And so they were auctioned in the 1950s. They were auctioned and they were sold to private collectionists and then to some libraries, like I was saying, across North America and Europe. And so they were scattered at that moment all around the world. And I think there's a sort of a catalog that was prepared by Seneschal at the time. So Frédéric Marty, in 2022, he published sort of the first modern edition of this really long, extensive treatise. And Angela Hunter and Angelica Wilking also. But it's like to give you an idea, I think Marty's book has like, I don't know, more than 400 pages or something. And then, there are different versions of different articles. So for instance, the Discours préliminaire has different versions. So he sort of Marty published a different version separately from this 2022 edition. Yeah, so the treatise is divided into four parts, but it's really an effort to reconstruct women's history and to fight this sort of misogynistic history of women that had culturally, historically prevailed. And she analyzes the sort of, or she criticizes the idea that women are inferior in terms of physiology. Then she goes on to study history, legal rights, morality. So so it's quite extensive, and but she abandons this at some point in her life and decides. I mean, she never publishes it so I mean, as far as I know. So yeah.
Thank
Thank you very
Natalia.
much to the two of you. Kirsten, please.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. I'm curious about kind of how Dupin fits in with other women authors. I mean, not necessarily from her time period. It struck me that as she was speaking, it struck me that a lot of her strategy was very reminiscent of even people like Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies, right, where she says all these men keep telling us that women are bad and not good at things and so on, and then she goes through and kind of lists woman after woman throughout history who has been either kind of morally good or or a scholar and so on. And so she kind of does this history to kind of to disprove what these men are saying. And you've got other women throughout history kind of going head to head with the male scholars and kind of going through. I mean, I'm also thinking of kind of von Sherman, who kind of carefully goes through the syllogisms that the men are putting forward about why women shouldn't be educated, and kind of going through them premise by premise and refuting them and things like this. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious about what the broader picture is here. Is she being influenced by these kinds of writings to kind of do this kind of work? Are other women engaging with her?
Sorry, the last thing you said was if other women were engaging with her, or
Yeah. her work or with her?
So that, I mean, I'm not sure because like I was saying, this wasn't really published, and I'm not sure if that circulated in a manuscript form. I don't have any notice of that I can remember. But so as to your question about the broader picture, I mean, you're right that it's a I think in previous feminist writings, what you can find is the use of historical examples to disprove this idea that women were not virtuous, that women were not, didn't have any intellectual talent, that women were not strong warriors. And so this was, yeah, it appears in many of these feminist texts. Even from the Querelle des Femmes. So, um, so yeah, I see the connection there, I guess. But in Dupin's case, I would say it's not just about showing that exceptional women existed. I'm not saying that Christine de Pisano, Marie de Gournay, or Van Schurman, or whoever did this. I'm not. But I think in Dupin's case, um, it's more about showing that the general picture about women was that they were, at least in ancient times, that they were living in more, yeah, more of an equal position with regards to men in terms of power. And so not just about women who were exceptional, so not just about what women could be, right, if they had the proper education. But I think her hypothesis is more radical than that. So what she's saying is women, actually, what the past shows us is that women, were as powerful as men at some, in some cultures at some point in, because she also, this is something that really complicates things, I guess, but it's also why her text is so rich and interesting, is that she really makes a point of examining different cultures, different territories, different historical times. So, so it's so yeah. So it's the text is very complex in that, I would say, in that regard. And I was thinking about yesterday's session where we were talking about incommensurability. You know, I think it was Evelyn's talk. She was talking about logical incommensurability, and then with Hanik, the point also came up about cultural incommensurability. And so she's with Dupin. I struggle with this because um, she analyzes so many different cultures that um, it's really difficult um, to see the unified criteria for the evaluation that she makes. And in my opinion, she really um, she has a very complicated stance on um, racialized women under colonial domination. So that's another, I mean, I didn't talk about this, but um, yeah, so I think for her, these women represent, the model of the strong natural women. So what could have been of women if civilization had not really weakened them? So it's a sort of a different problem. Yeah, but it's there as well.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Thank you very much, Kirsten. And thank you, everybody. Please, let's thank Natalia with a round of applauses. Before doing that, Valeria has a question. Sorry, Aurelia has a question. And I will ask you to be more or less precise and concrete because we have not that much time. So, Aurelia.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. I was intrigued by this idea, and I think Zainab also touched upon it. The not the construction of knowledge through archives, but actually the construction of ignorance through archives. The fact that most of the remains we have left usually tend to support a single or a dominant point of view. And that's also a common problem in historiography, the need to have to go against the grain and also to hold upon like very few evidence actually to see a different point of view. So that leaves us with, well, like in Zainab's example, there is this deliberate production of ignorance. And I wanted to know, like, how you see that in the case of women. How does it work? And like the status we can give to this little evidence that we have, for example, of different points of view about women. Thank you.
But you mean in Poulain and Dupin's works?
Well, yeah. I mean, you think it's a deliberate, like what? I mean, they were obviously fighting against the dominant point of view, and I don't know. I find it interesting that it like your example gives us a very good counter example, but it's also I don't know how. Like if you can generalize it, or how do you use it, or is it like exceptional, for example?
No, for sure that, I mean, both of them say in their works that misogyny is a very pervasive prejudice and it's like widespread. And particularly Dupin characterizes it as a delusion. So it's very, it's sort of a very strong description. But what they try to do is really analyze sort of the passions, right? How it came to be that, how it comes to be that some men and some women are really so engaged in defending women's inferiority. So, sorry, okay. So yeah, they treat these as a delusion, but it's everywhere for them. It's in the gendered education that women receive, like what Gournay will call mauvaise éducation. It's in the way they are, relinquished to motherhood and do not have any sort of space for personal development. Yeah, I would say, and that for them, that is that causes a series of problems because how do you fight? How do you fight philosophically an opinion that is, in their view, easily destructed by rational analysis? I mean, if you or by common sense, Dupin will use this expression, common sense. So it's not just in the archives; it's in in everyday interactions. But the problem is that women are, in their view, always depicted as, vicious or evil. There's always this sort of in history, in historians' account. Sorry, I think my son just woke up, so if you hear him, he's 2.5, sorry. So yeah, I would say that there's a problem there. How to deal with this philosophically? Like I was saying at the beginning of the talk, it's following Martina Reuter, it's an entrenched commitment. It's not just, the philosophical discussion of are men and women equal in intellectual or deliberative capacities. It's much more than that. So yeah, I don't know if